Good evening and welcome, students, colleagues, guests. For those of you who don't know me, my name's David Bell and I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Reading. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for the 2018 Wolfenden Lecture. This event is the second in a new annual University of Reading lecture series given by high-profile members of the LGBT+ community in the UK. The lecture is named in recognition of the 1957 report of the Wolfenden Committee, which was chaired by Sir John Wolfenden, who at the time was the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Reading, a post he occupied between 1950 and 1964. The Wolfenden Report, or to give it its full name, the Report of the Departmental Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, was an important milestone in LGBT+ history in the UK when it recommended that, quote, homosexual behaviour between consenting adults in private should no longer be a criminal offence. Wolfenden's report did not lead to an immediate change in the law. That was to take a few more years. However, it was a step along the way in helping to change the political and public climate. Fast forward from Wolfenden's report in the late 1950s to the late 1980s, and you come to the focus of tonight's lecture, which covers almost certainly the most notorious piece of legislation that affected the LGBT+ community. 24th of March 2018 marks the 30th anniversary of the enactment of Section 28 of the Local Government Act 1988 in England, Wales and Scotland. The amendment of the Act stated that a local authority, quote, shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, or, quote, promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. We are delighted that Peter Tatchell is here to join us this evening and deliver the second Wolfenden Lecture. Peter is an internationally renowned LGBT+ and human rights activist. He has been campaigning since 1967 on issues of human rights, democracy, civil liberties, LGBT+ equality, and global justice. He has been quoted as saying that his human rights inspirations include Mahatma Gandhi, Sylvia Pankhurst, and Martin Luther King. In 2009, he co-proposed a UN Global Human Rights Index to measure and rank the human rights record of every country with the aim of creating a human rights league table to highlight the best and worst countries and thereby incentivize governments to clean up their record and improve their human rights ranking. Peter's international presence, of course, is also seen across the media, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome him this evening. The title of Peter's lecture is Section 28, A Poisonous Law and Legacy. Just before I invite Peter to the stage, we are delighted to be able to live stream tonight's lecture, including the Q&A session, so that those who are unable to join us can participate in this important event. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Peter Tatchell, to deliver the 2018 Wolfenden Lecture.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Reading University, for hosting tonight's event. And very importantly, thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. I am very honoured to be able to deliver this second annual Wolfenden Lecture, named in honour of Sir John Wolfenden, the former Vice-Chancellor of Reading University and the chair of the committee that recommended the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1957. This month, many people will be talking about Section 28. We are talking about a legacy, a poisonous legacy, a damaging, devastating legacy for LGBT people, which lasted all of 15 years while that evil legislation was on the statute book. So as we recall the 30th anniversary of Section 28, we do need to remind ourselves that its legacy did not end in 2003 with its repeal. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think the first observation that I want to make is that Section 28 was the first new anti-gay law in Britain in 100 years. And it was the first UK law to target lesbianism as well as male homosexuality. And this is what that legislation said. A local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality. It will not promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Now, you will note that in this legislation, promotion is not defined, intention is not defined, and the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship is not defined. It was all left very vague. But what we know very clearly is the intention. The intention was to suppress information, advice, and support to LGBT people via local authorities. I read that out as it is written. Just think if the word Judaism was substituted for homosexuality. This is how it would read. A local authority shall not intentionally promote Judaism or publish material with the intention of promoting Judaism. It shall not promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of Judaism as a pretended family relationship. I cite that to give you a flavor of the viciousness, the evilness of this legislation. If it had been targeted Jewish people, it would not have seen the light of day. But back in those days, LGBT people were seen as fair game. MPs, or the majority of MPs, not all MPs, but the majority of MPs thought they could get away with political gay bashing. And they did get away with it for 15 years. Section 28 happened in a toxic homophobic atmosphere, an era very, very different from what we live through today. The context of Section 28 was, for example, the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, pursuing two major morality campaigns in the 1980s. Victorian values, she wanted a return to strict, puritanical Victorian morality, and then later, family values, very much focused on traditional marriage and traditional families. In neither instance was there any place for people who are LGBT or T, nor was there any acceptance for the love those people shared. Margaret Thatcher, of course, went one step further than those two campaigns when in 1987, at the Conservative Party conference, the Prime Minister of this country publicly attacked the right to be gay, suggesting there was no such right. She sent a signal from the very top that it was open season on LGBT people. And just months later, Section 28 was spawned. There was also, in this period, the immense moral panic around HIV and AIDS, in which gay and bisexual men were demonized and scapegoated as threats to the public health. There were headlines saying, "1 million of us will die," and pointing the finger at gay and bisexual men. Indeed, in that period, homosexuality was demonized and HIV was demonized. And in fact, HIV was demonized as, quote, the gay plague. That's the language that was used. That this was the equivalent of a new deadly disease, a plague, an epidemic, a pandemic that threatened every person in Britain. And the people to blame, said the government and many MPs, were gay and bisexual men. So no wonder, with these attitudes emanating from the highest levels of the political establishment, no wonder there was this febrile, inflammatory, sensationalist, and bigoted atmosphere that led to Section 28. It also coincided with a huge rise in the arrests of gay and bisexual men. As we all know, the law reform of 1967 was a very limited, partial law reform. Most aspects of gay male life remained criminalized after that legislation. And indeed, in the few years after the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, the number of gay and bisexual men convicted for consenting same-sex behavior rose by 400%. In the late 70s, early 80s, it calmed down. But then, in the context of Margaret Thatcher's moral crusades, her speech at the Conservative Party conference, the moral panic around HIV, there was a huge, massive escalation in arrests. So in 1989, the year after Section 28 became law, the number of gay and bisexual men arrested and convicted for consenting offences was almost as high as in 1954-55, when male homosexuality was still totally illegal, and when the country was gripped by a McCarthyite-style anti-gay witch hunt. The number of gay offences of, quote, gross indecency, which simply means any sexual contact between men other than anal intercourse, the number of offences recorded in 1989 for that offence was 2,022, almost as high as in 1954 and 55. There was also a wave of gay-bashing violence and murders. I can remember going around finding out local newspaper stories about the arrest of gay and bisexual men. I did not and could not have possibly looked at every local paper. But my search, limited as it was, found that dozens of gay and bisexual men had been murdered in circumstances that pointed to a homophobic motive. For example, they were not robbed, their homes were not stripped of contents, and they were often subjected to extremely brutal murders, the kinds of frenzied murder that indicates a hate attack. People stabbed 20, 30, 50, 70 times. In the period 1986 to 1991, I identified over 50 gay and bisexual men who had been murdered in circumstances which pointed to a homophobic motive. That was higher, even higher than the level of racist murders in that period. And racist murders were a major, major issue. And a shocking level of racist murders, but the number of queer-bashing murders was even greater in that era. Simultaneously, in this kind of atmosphere, public attitudes hardened. Whereas through the early to mid-1980s, public opinion had gone to grow more accepting of same-sex relationships, by the late 1980s, 1988, 1989, they went into reverse. So in that period, the British Social Attitude Survey found that 2/3 of British people believed that homosexuality was mostly or always wrong. 2/3. We also had this view publicly expressed in ways that we'd not witnessed for 2 decades or more. People openly expressing in public, in newspapers, in headlines in the press, in phone-in programs, in the street at the workplace, foul, threatening and menacing language against LGBT people. People were sacked from their jobs. People were afraid to walk out at night alone. People were attacked coming out of gay bars and clubs, attacked outside their homes, set upon by gangs whose hatred had been fueled by the level of prejudice that had been stirred by people at the very top of the political establishment. The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, bears personal, direct responsibility for creating an atmosphere that allowed such prejudice, discrimination, and violence. She never once spoke out against it. She never once rode back and said, I caution people, you may disagree with homosexuality, but do not harm a gay person. She could have said that. She was asked to say it, but she refused. She refused. The only words that came from her were words against the LGBT community. And it wasn't just Parliament and the government. It was the Church of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury and his bishops said that homosexuality fell short of the Christian ideal, that gay people must repent, implying that we were inferior human beings and refusing to support any initiatives for LGBT equality. And once again, we never heard church leaders speak out against the wave of violence. We never heard them say that discrimination and violence are not Christian values. No, they never said that. They remained silent. They just preached against LGBT people, but never uttered a word to condemn the homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic atmosphere that was going on all around. In Parliament, there were many, many, many very bigoted speeches, offensive speeches, to justify Section 28. Now, I'll just give you a few examples. This is from the Hansard of the 9th of March, 1988. Nicholas Fairbairn, a prominent Conservative MP, described homosexuality as a psychopathological manifestation. He then went on further in the debate to say that it was indicative of character perversions. His colleague, the Conservative MP, Mrs. Caleb Bowman, was of a similar persuasion. She was quoted in Parliament saying, "The practice of sodomy or buggery is not civilized." There were others. She later on said, I am quite proud to affirm that it is quite right that there should be an intolerance of evil. LGBT people were evil. And she said there should be intolerance towards these evil people. This was in Parliament. It wasn't in some barroom brawl or on some thuggish Yob's estate. This was in Parliament from a senior Conservative member of Parliament. Nicholas Bennett, another of her colleagues, described the homosexual act as intrinsically immoral and evil. Again, evil. Not just bad or wrong or sinful, but evil. And then again, we go back to Elizabeth Callet-Bowman. She also said, quite right, I believe that the intolerance of evil should grow. She was encouraging intolerance, sanctioning and legitimating intolerance towards LGBT people. She regarded us, as did Margaret Thatcher, as the enemy within. And when the news came through that the officers of the newspaper Capital Gay had been firebombed, Elaine Callet-Bowman said that she, again, believed there should be an intolerance of evil and described the report about the firebombing as quite right, which many people interpreted as a sanction for that firebombing attack. Elaine Callet-Bowman was a close colleague of Margaret Thatcher's. As I said, did once Margaret Thatcher ever speak out against this foul, menacing language? No, she never did. The essence of Section 28 and its supporters in Parliament could be summed up in three ways. They oppose any action against anti-gay discrimination to protect LGBT people against inequality and bias. They believed that it was right that the law should discriminate, that LGBT people did not deserve equal human rights. They opposed any supportive information or counselling for LGBT pupils in schools. They said it would encourage this vice, this evil, and must, under no circumstances, ever be permitted. They also opposed even the acknowledgement or awareness that there were people of different sexual orientations. So they said it was absolutely wrong to discuss the idea that people could have different sexual orientations from the heterosexual norm. That was not permissible, they said. And that informed much of the debate, which eventually led to a successful majority in Parliament and the legislation of Section 28. I mentioned earlier that there was a very toxic, violent, homophobic atmosphere. Certainly with this kind of language from parliamentarians and others, it did very much legitimate anti-LGBT hate and violence. A theatre at Milton Keynes that was showing a gay play was firebombed. Assailants unknown, but in this atmosphere, the other theatres in the town were not firebombed, just this one with the gay play. I'm not too sure, I can't remember whether it was Leeds or Newcastle, but a bomb was planted in a litter bin outside a gay bar. I think it was either Leeds or Newcastle. And it went off. Fortunately exploded when everybody had gone through the queue and into the club. If it had gone off maybe 20 minutes earlier, people would have probably been killed and maimed. And as I mentioned, the officers of Capital Gay newspaper were firebombed as well. I can remember going on a march in Newcastle against Section 28, where the police told us that they had had some warning or evidence of some sort that there was some crazy with a rifle who was intent on shooting the marchers. That was not, well, it was a bit, I suppose, a bit surprising, but it was not entirely unexpected in this atmosphere. In the end, nothing happened. But I can tell you, walking through those streets that day, when the police had apparently had serious information that someone with a rifle was going to shoot the crowd, that was quite scary. In terms of Section 28's remit, as you know, it applied to local authorities. In other words, to local councils and local education and health authorities. Now, although no one was ever prosecuted under Section 28, it did lead to massive self-censorship. People working for local authorities self-censored in order to avoid the risk of prosecution. They decided that given this law, it was best to err on the side of caution. So, for example, councils stopped or refused to fund LGBT plus helplines. They declined to allow LGBT plus groups to use council premises. They dropped information about LGBT issues from council publications. It was an act of self-censorship, provoked by this intimidatory legislation. Some local health authorities rode back on their outreach to LGBT communities and toned down their safer sex advice to gay and bisexual men. Again, out of fear that what they did could be construed as, quote, promoting homosexuality and therefore be unlawful. In schools all over the country, LGBT-themed books were pulled from libraries, and plans for gay films and plays were scrapped. I can remember going to schools in this period and being told, we'd scheduled a gay-themed play to educate and inform our young kids about these issues, but in the light of Section 28, we've had to cancel it. Even worse, perhaps, teachers were afraid to give sympathetic, supportive advice to LGBT plus pupils. They removed references to LGBT issues from their curriculum and lessons, including from health education and safer sex education. LGBT staff in this period were afraid to be open, so they hid their sexuality. They either didn't come out, or if they had come out, they went back in the closet, because they feared that if they were openly gay, this could be construed as promoting homosexuality. They feared disciplinary action. So overall, I think we can say that Section 28 was a huge betrayal of a whole generation of LGBT youth who didn't get the support, information, advice that they needed. I believe it contributed to many preventable suicides or attempted suicides and HIV infections. These happened because Section 28 was deemed to prevent emotional and psychological support and affirmation, and to prevent objective sexual health advice targeted at young gay and bisexual men. Even after Section 28 was eventually repealed in 2003, its poisonous legacy continued for the best part of another decade. Think about it. for 15 years, schools had no experience and no staff experienced in discussing LGBT issues or supporting LGBT pupils. When young kids came to staff members for help, most of them simply said, "I'm sorry, I can't discuss that with you." So there was no tradition, no history, no experience in most schools. So they had to start from scratch all over again. And even then, teachers were still fearful of negative, hostile reactions. Even though Section 28 was history, after 2003, teaching staff feared negative, hostile reactions from other teachers, from pupils, from parents, and from school governors. I can remember even just a decade ago, talking to teachers in schools and saying, "Oh yes, we'd like to discuss these issues now that Section 28 is gone, but we're really fearful of the reaction we'll get. We're really fearful that other staff, other pupils, other teachers, other parents, school governors, that they will react negatively." So the question I want to ask to take things forward is, what next do we need to do in this post-Section 28 era? There is clearly still a major problem. So if you look at the Stonewall School Report of 2017, we find that nearly half of LGBT plus pupils, 45%, are being bullied for being LGBT plus in Britain's schools. Nearly half are still being bullied, or were still being bullied in 2017 because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, the good news is this is down from 55% who were experiencing bullying in 2012 and down from 65% in 2007. So it is on a downward trend, but still 45% have experienced bullying because of their sexuality or gender identity. Half of pupils also reported hearing homophobic slurs, either, quote, frequently or often at school. Frequently or often. Not once or twice, but frequently or often. They heard these slurs. And again, it's an improvement from 2012 when 7 in 10 LGBT pupils said they had heard such slurs frequently or often. Teaching unions have said that gay is now the most common abuse in the school playground. It's replaced racism and disability and other forms of abuse. Gay is now the most common slur or abuse in the school playground. On a positive side, again, 7 in 10 LGBT pupils in 2017 reported that their school had at least indicated that homophobic and biphobic bullying is wrong. So that's a big improvement on 2012, when only half of schools said that it was wrong. And back in 2007, only a quarter said it was wrong. So again, we're moving in the right direction, but it is shocking that 3 out of 10 schools do not send that message to their pupils that homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying is wrong. In fact, just 2 in 5 LGBT pupils said their school said that transphobic bullying is wrong. Just 2 in 5, so that's less than half, have given a message to their pupils that transphobic bullying is wrong. Last year, just 1 in 5 LGBT pupils said they'd been taught about safe sex in relation to same-sex relationships. Just 1 in 5. So 4 out of 5 say that although they were LGBT, they never got that information about safer sex in relation to their own sexuality and sexual relationships. More than 4 in 5 trans young people have self-harmed. More than 4 in 5, 80% of young trans people have self-harmed because of the pressures that they experienced, as have 3 in 5 lesbian, gay, and bisexual young people who are not trans. Again, these are really, really shocking statistics. So you can get a sense that although Section 28 is gone, the needs of LGBT plus pupils in schools are not being adequately addressed. That too many schools are looking the other way. And I just want to quote from a couple of examples of what young pupils said. Zoe, aged 12, just starting at secondary school in England, said, quote, "I felt like whatever I was doing was worthless. Even if I did well in school, it wouldn't matter to people because all they would care about is me being gay." Reese, aged 18, from the northeast of England, quote, "No one I've spoken to at school has ever knowingly met a trans person before or been taught anything about trans people and what we might need." And finally, Dorian, aged 13, in the West Midlands, quote, "Once in sex education, I asked about safe sex in same-sex relationships, and I was told that it was inappropriate and that this is not suitable for classroom discussion. I was told to leave the room." So you get a flavor that these attitudes persist even though Section 28 is now history. And that is pretty damning. It shows that the legacy of Section 28 lingers and that so much more work needs to be done to make our schools a safe place, an informative, supportive place for LGBT plus kids. So I want to think about the future. And when I think about the future, I think, well, I want to live in a kind, gentle, harmonious society. I'm sure we all do. If that's true, how can we do something, or what can we do to make the likelihood of that aspiration becoming a future reality? And of course, one way is education. Perhaps we can't do much about older people like me or others. Perhaps we're set in our ways, but for younger people, education is key. Educating the younger generation into humanitarian and liberal values of understanding, tolerance and respect for others who are different, that strikes me as pretty fundamental. No child is born bigoted. No child comes out of the womb with prejudice. That is learned behavior. It's learned from parents and other adults. It's learned from other kids at school. It's learned from the tabloid press. Now, if prejudice can be learned, then so can acceptance of diversity. And I think there's a really important role for schools in this process. Schools, teachers, governors, they can play a really important role. But of course, the government needs to give a lead. These things won't happen without leadership, without a drive to make them happen. As you saw from those statistics, or as you heard from those statistics, so many schools are still failing LGBT kids, and indeed other kids as well. So for many years, I've been urging successive education secretaries to make lessons in human rights, equality and diversity mandatory in every school, from the first year of primary education throughout a pupil's secondary schooling. What we need is a turbocharged version of PSHE, personal, social and health education. Not once or twice a year, but a regular inbuilt part of weekly lessons. The aim should be to tackle all forms of ignorance and prejudice. Not just prejudice against LGBT people, but also racism, misogyny, and more. And also to counter issues like sexual abuse, sexual harassment, gang culture, and far-right extremism, whether they're from the traditional far right or from the Islamist far right. Now, those issues are problems in our schools. They're problems in our society. But I believe that education can play a really important role in undermining them. I can't fathom why the government will not agree to these mandatory equality and diversity lessons. It talks about, or it pays lip service to, an inclusive society, acceptance of difference, equality and diversity. But we need more than principles, we need more than words, we need action. And to me, it does not seem a huge ask to suggest that this should include mandatory equality and diversity lessons in every school. I think it's pretty obvious that they could help. Maybe they won't eradicate all prejudice and bullying, but in schools where it's been tried, the levels of bullying have gone way down. It's not a panacea or a total solution, but undoubtedly these lessons would be a way to move us in the right direction. I think that the likelihood of bullying and hate crime is likely to go down. I think we're likely to end up with a more inclusive, kind and gentle society. If education is about preparing young people for adult life, and I believe that is its basic purpose, we teach kids about English, mathematics, science and so on. This is all preparation for being an adult in the world and having an informed, educated, fulfilling life, being able to get a job. Well, that's all fine. We all agree on that. But we also, I think, need to say that this education and this preparation for adult life should also teach young people about those who are different. The different people they will meet at school, in their neighborhoods, at work, in their social life, so that we can all get along together better and lead happier, more fulfilled lives in a society that embraces all and marginalizes none. If we can undermine the ignorance and prejudice that fuels not just homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, but other forms of prejudice, like against black and ethnic minority people, then I think we will be moving to a better kind of society. So this brings me to the specific issue of bullying in Britain's schools. How do we effectively undermine and deal with the kind of bullying that I mentioned earlier, the kind of dreadful statistics? How do we move towards making homophobia, biphobia and transphobia history? How can we delegitimize anti-LGBT bullying and hate crime? I mentioned that mandatory equality and diversity lessons are one way, but I think another way is, of course, to make relationship and sex education mandatory in schools, which it will become in 2019, next year, which is good, but also ensure that it includes LGBT issues. You heard the statistics earlier. So many kids don't get information in their sex and relationship educations or their safer sex HIV lessons. So the aim is to get this education in every school. And the government is committed to it. It says that from September next year, every school will be required by law to have lessons on relationship and sex education. And it has indicated this will include LGBT plus issues. That's great. But we don't yet know the content. We don't know how often these lessons will be. If they're once or twice a year, that's not going to work. We don't know whether they're going to go beyond the sort of biology and reproduction facets that most sex and relationship education is stuck in today. What we do know is that if young LGBT plus kids feel included, if their sexuality and gender identity is affirmed and validated, that's going to reduce stigma-related consequences for LGBT pupils. We know that where there is prejudice and bullying and hate crime, that young LGBT kids underperform academically, they're more likely to truant, they suffer from anxiety and depression, and many of them contemplate or actually commit self-harm. Now, these are all different consequences of the current failings of many, not all, but many schools. LGBT inclusive relationship and sex education needs to also address the specific health needs of LGBT pupils, in particular safer sex, in order to prevent HIV and, of course, many other sexually transmitted infections. My own view is that there should be no opt-outs for faith schools. Disappointingly, the new Education Secretary, Damien Hinds, seems equivocal on this point. It's unclear whether he will require faith schools and what exemptions or qualifications to relationship and sex education he might allow. I think we've got to say that faith schools are entitled to teach their own ethos, but not to ignore the sexual and emotional health needs of all pupils, in particular those who are LGBT or T. In addition, I don't believe that parents should have the right to withdraw their children from relationship and sex education. No more than they should have the right to withdraw their kids from English, maths, history, or science. You know, relationship and sex education is about protecting young people from sexual harm and damage. Every parent surely wants that. You know, relationship and sex education is not about encouraging or endorsing sex. It's not about giving a green light for young people to have sex at an early age. As we know, it's better if they wait. But what it is saying is that if young people do have sex, and about 50% of them have their first sexual experience nowadays by the age of 13 or 14, 50% by the age of 13 or 14, before they start adopting bad, unsafe habits, they need to get the advice they need. They need to get the information they need to inform them about how to have sex safely, responsibly, towards themselves and towards their partner. And I would have thought that even faith schools would want that. That even religious motivated schools would want their pupils to, if they're going to have sex, to do so responsibly, safely, and respectfully. But the government is apparently going to keep the option of the parental opt-out. It's going to maintain the current position, which is that a parent has a right to withdraw their child from relationship and sex education. Now, what I would suggest is, okay, let's keep that right, reluctantly. Let's keep the right of parents to withdraw their children. but let's require them to come to the school and physically take their child out of each lesson. As of now, they simply write a note and the child is exempted. I think we need to get the parents to show the proof of the sincerity of their conviction by coming to the school and taking their child out. In the handful of schools that have tried this unofficially, the levels of parental withdrawal went to almost zero. And a few parents complained, but after the initial fuss, they got used to it. So I think that's really the way to go. I think also teachers ought to be aware that to teach good equality and diversity lessons, to teach good quality relationship and sex education, teachers themselves need education and support. You know, a teacher of science or mathematics or whatever, they get specialist training so they can teach their subject well. At the moment, the teacher who does relationship and sex education, well, that's just pot luck. A teacher out of the kindness of their heart volunteering. But hardly any of them get any training. The Sex Education Forum has a program of training for teachers, but it's tiny compared to the number of teachers in the country. But what I would say is that teachers can go to a website called The Classroom, the-classroom.org.uk. And there, a group of mostly LGBT, but some straight teachers, have produced online lessons integrating LGBT issues into most subjects in the curriculum. So they give a LGBT spin on mathematics, on physics, every subject under the sun, there's an LGBT dimension. So it's really easy for teachers to download these lessons and to use them in their classes. The other thing I'd say is that where schools have undertaken these kinds of positive changes, they do get positive results. I can remember some years ago going to a school in North London which had a really, really big problem with all kinds of prejudice. Racism between African, Asian, and Afro-Caribbean kids, incredible levels of misogyny, sexism, and sexual harassment, plus homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So I went and did a talk there about the importance of respecting difference. I'm not too sure I convinced that many people, but some of the pupils came forward when I suggested the idea of setting up an equality and diversity network in the school, led by the pupils. And 5 pupils came forward on that day. 3 of them, Muslim girl pupils wearing hijabs, not the persons you might first expect, but they were the most passionate in wanting to challenge the prejudice. And eventually they got about a dozen other kids involved over a period of about several months. And when I got the report back a year or 2 later from the staff who had invited me, they said, look, you'd be amazed at the impact of your talk, even though it wasn't apparent at the time, but more importantly, the fact that the pupils set up this equality and diversity network. The teacher said, the levels of all kinds of prejudice in our school have gone way down. Racism, misogyny, and homophobia, they're all much, much less than they were when you came 2 years ago. So I think it does show that when pupils themselves are encouraged, empowered, and supported to set up their own networks, they can make a really big impact, that peer-to-peer education really does work. The final thing I'd say to round it off about Section 28, what should schools teach pupils about sex? That's a big question, a question the government always shies away from. It's nervous. It's afraid of the Daily Mail. It's afraid of faith organizations. But I think that this is an issue that applies not just to LGBT plus pupils, but also to straight kids as well. We need meaningful, serious relationship and sex education in our schools for all pupils. Not for some, but for all. And so for me, the campaign for a better deal for LGBT plus kids is also a campaign for a better deal for all kids. Currently, so much of sex and relationship education is about the body, the biology of the body, hormones, puberty, and a lot about reproduction, most of it not human reproduction, but the reproduction of guinea pigs or rabbits or whatever. That is not good enough. And young people in every survey that's ever been undertaken all say the same thing, that their relationship with sex education is not adequate. It doesn't answer the questions they have. It skirts around and avoids the issues that they want to discuss. Of course, to me, you have to, put these issues in a moral framework. Not a moralistic framework, not a puritanical framework, but I've argued that for those who are religious or have other issues around human sexuality, surely there are just three basic key principles that ought to guide relationship and sex education, and they are mutual consent, mutual respect, and mutual fulfillment. That works for kids, whatever their sexual orientation or gender identity. But more than that, I think it is right that schools do teach pupils about sex itself. I mean, sex and relationships are two of the most important things in most people's lives. The person you love and the person you have a relationship and perhaps marry or have a civil partnership with or just cohabit with, that relationship is one of the most important things in most people's lives. Yet all the research shows that a majority of people in this country are dissatisfied with their sexual and emotional lives. They don't feel fulfilled, particularly women. We have to change that. If our objective is to have happier, more fulfilled human beings, to have happier, more fulfilled relationships, to reduce the levels of relationship breakdown, to reduce the levels of acrimony and fights and intolerance within relationships, teaching young people about emotional intelligence and about how to have mutually fulfilling sex, I think is really important. We know from young girls in particular that so many of them are dissatisfied with their first, and often sometimes much later, sexual experiences. I can remember going to a school and asking boys, tell me about the clitoris. Not a single boy in the school I think there were about 150 boys in the audience, not one could identify. They knew it was something to do with sex and something to do with women's private parts, but they couldn't say where it was or what it did. I thought to myself, look guys, you are really, really losing out for yourself, but particularly you're losing out for the women if you have sex with them. This is not fair to think about you and your penis and forget about the clitoris and the vagina. And when we talked about it, the young kids these were all 15, 16, 17, they were all gobsmacked, and they said things like, no one's ever told us this before. We have our sex and relationship education, they never discuss these kinds of things. I asked them about erogenous zones, and a few people knew a bit, but most people had no idea what erogenous zones were or where to find them or how to stimulate them or their role in foreplay and sexual happiness and fulfillment. I just thought to myself, this shows what a mess we're in. These things should be standard and obvious for every young person so they can have a happy, fulfilled sexual and emotional life and so they can have a happy, fulfilled partner. Sex shouldn't be a one-way thing. Relationships shouldn't be a one-way thing. It's a mutual thing. And, men and women, or men and men and women, need to understand the mechanics, the ways of doing these things so that they can have the happy, fulfilled relationships that they deserve. So I think there is some considerable way to go before we have the kind of high-quality sex and relationship education that our young people need. We have got rid of Section 28. The levels of homophobia, as you've heard, are less than they were. More schools are addressing the issue, but whether it be LGBT kids or straight kids, much, much more work needs to be done. We need to ensure that all our young people, whatever their sexuality or gender identity, that they all have the right to the information, support, affirmation, advice, and facts that they need to have fulfillment. Thank you.
Peter, you can tell from the audience reaction how well that went down. Thank you very much for such an interesting, wide-ranging and stimulating talk. We've got a few minutes for questions, and I wonder if I could just ask you for two courtesies. One is that you wait until we get a microphone to you so that everyone else in the audience can hear you. And two, to allow a number of questions, can you please keep your question short? We've got microphones. Who would like to be the first to ask a question? Good, we've got one at the front here, so we can get a microphone right down to the front. Thanks, Anastasia.
I'm just wondering, I'm a teacher myself. I actually do trans awareness sessions in schools. And they have always gone down very well. But I'm wondering, I'm a science teacher. I do the reproduction, but less so the relationship part, which is always seen as PSEG. What is it you think that is inhibiting teachers and schools from doing more of this?
I think it probably relates to the fact that we live in a culture which is both fascinated by sex and even obsessed by sex, but then on the other hand is very reticent to even discuss it in a sensible way. So, the tabloids are saturated with sex. School playgrounds are full of sexual jokes and innuendo. But in terms of having a serious discussion, I think we've still got a long way to go. And I think that relates to a sort of a deep-seated, erotophobia or sex phobia. It leads people to be nervous, nervous about the reactions of others, feeling that perhaps in the current atmosphere, discussing sex openly is somehow linked to sexual abuse, sexual harassment, all the negative things that go with sex. And I've got to say that looking at the curriculums and advice given to many schools, and indeed the parliamentary report on sex and relationship education about three years ago, they are full of a lot of information about the dangers of sex. It makes sex very scary. So quite right, they talk about sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies and abortions, but it's an endless list of all the negatives, all the bad things. And of course, those things should be discussed and need to be brought to people's attention. But I just think the balance needs to be got a bit right. And I think the reason why is, ultimately, I think it's teachers are afraid of perhaps negative reactions from parents and some school governors.
Next question. One down at the front here.
Thank you for your speech. I wanted to ask, you touched a bit on moral and family values, and there's this idea that sometimes these exist. They are mutually exclusive to sort of LGBT rights, whether it's in a political establishment, a religious establishment. Some individuals still have that idea. And you touched a bit on how we can change that systematically. But as a person that's non-LGBT, constantly trying to champion the rights of LGBT plus community, I sometimes struggle when individuals have those ideas deeply ingrained in their thoughts and how to challenge them. What's your advice on that and going about it in a not so forceful way? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Well, I'd say that the concept of family is a concept of love, of people bound together by love and commitment. And that surely transcends sexuality or gender identity, or race or religion. We need to acknowledge there is a huge variety of different people and different relationships in our society, and that the family, as we traditionally have known it, has forever been evolving. You know, there's no such thing as a traditional family. You know, you go back in history, you know, in traditional families, women were the property of men. Children were the property of men. Until not that many years ago, rape within marriage was lawful. You know, and decades ago in our culture, well, centuries ago in our culture and in some parts of the world, the idea that a man can have several wives but a woman can only have one husband, that's par for the course. And of course, marriage as an institution, which is held up by some people, marriage was never about love. Originally, marriage was devised as a property relationship. Marriage was conceived as a way of ensuring paternity between father and son so that property could be passed down the male line. So love only came into it quite recently. People married for power, property, and so on. And in a way, I suppose you still see residues of this patriarchal dimension of marriage in the tradition, as we almost saw last Saturday, of the father of the bride giving away his daughter to the husband-to-be, which basically is a ritual symbolizing the passing of woman from one man to another. And even the words husband and wife, the alternative meaning of husband is to manage and control, which is the way many men treated women in marriages. So I think, you know, love and commitment, yes, lots of different ways of having family relationships, but those that are based on love, they're all equally valid.
Somebody signaling, I think somebody put their hand up. Yes, good.
Peter, do you think, if you think back to the debates around the bill in 1987, do you think the Labour Party could have done more, and the Liberal Democrats at the time could have done more to oppose the bill? I suppose what I'm asking is, was its passage inevitable? And could more have been done to mobilise people at the time? And are there any lessons to learn from that failure?
Well, of course, in that period, the Conservatives had a huge majority in Parliament. So there was very little that the opposition parties could do. Initially, some Labour members did actually support Section 28. They were boxed into a corner, it was sprung on them, and fearful of, you know, tabloid headlines, they sort of seemed to be going along with Section 28 initially. But then that very quickly changed. And it's to the great credit that not every Labour MP, but the vast majority of Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs did vote against. And many of them spoke very eloquently in the House of Commons and the House of Lords against the bill. I think with hindsight, it's really hard to imagine how the result could have been otherwise, because, as I said, the Conservatives had such a stonking majority, and in those days, you know, the tabloid headlines, I mean, you think the Sun had a headline around this time, Puffs in the Pulpit, an attack on gay clergy. Puffs in the Pulpit on the front page of the Sun, a national newspaper, when there was discussion that the armed forces might decriminalise homosexuality or allow LGBT plus people to serve. Another headline, I think also from the Sun, was Pufters on Parade. Pufters on Parade, a national newspaper. That was the kind of toxic atmosphere that existed in those days.
We've got time for one more question, one here, and then I'll take the lady behind as well, but two here. So, person at the front, could you just put your hand up so that we can get the microphone to you, sir? Thank you. And then we'll do just behind, 2 rows behind, so we can get the last 2 questions.
You had a good go at Margaret Thatcher, quite rightly, I think. But there were a lot of MPs around who had her ear. Matthew Parris and Michael Portillo. I know an ex-boyfriend came out the closet and embarrassed him. So she was influenced by quite some people. Are you saying that they didn't really do enough to prevent or to encourage her to take a stand on this?
Well, I don't know precisely what they said or didn't say to her, but clearly it didn't work. Even if they did try to discourage her, that obviously did not work, and there weren't enough of them. There were a handful of Liberal Tory MPs, one of which, Robin Squire, the MP for Hornchurch in Essex. I've got absolutely huge admiration for him. As a Conservative MP, he had been, ever since he entered Parliament, an absolutely cast iron 100% supporter of the LGBT community. He was going against his party. He, to me, is a real hero because it takes real courage to stand up almost as a lone voice against the majority in your party. Charles Irving, another MP at the time from Cheltenham, he also spoke out, but Robin Squire really was the key Conservative person, and he spoke tremendously eloquently and movingly in Parliament against Section 28.
Last question.
I'm from Northern Ireland, and I'm just wondering, when do you think Northern Ireland's going to move on with the rest of the UK in regards to LGBT issues, especially after when Theresa May said that it was a devolved issue when we don't have a devolved government at the moment?
Yeah, I'm really torn about marriage equality in Northern Ireland because, you know, with the new constitutional arrangement where things like marriage are devolved to the 4 nations of the UK, then clearly that should be a matter for those national parliaments and assemblies. The problem is, in Northern Ireland, we have Democratic Unionist Party, which, even though most of its own members do not support the ban on same-sex marriage, the leadership does, even though the most recent poll, I think, found that 76% of Northern Irish people support equal marriage. 76%, even higher than in the Republic. And that's, again, I pay huge tribute to people in Northern Ireland because they've undergone an incredible journey. Just, I think, 15 years ago, the north of Ireland was designated in European polls as being the most homophobic place in Western Europe. You know, on every indice, it was behind the curve. You know, the number of Northern Irish people who said they would not like to have a neighbour who was gay was way, way, way above England, Scotland and Wales, and way above other European countries. So Northern Irish people have been on a fantastic, commendable journey towards equality and understanding. The problem is, of course, although the devolved assembly has been ended, and although there is now direct rule from Westminster, and although this means that the Westminster Parliament could legislate marriage equality, there is a reticence to do so, not out of any moral principle. I don't buy that Theresa May is holding back because she thinks devolution is such an important principle. She's holding back because she needs the support of the DUP to survive in power. And that's really, really shameful. I think probably on balance, I'm veering towards saying, look, you know, clearly there's a majority of the public in Northern Ireland who support marriage equality, therefore Westminster should legislate, because the DUP ain't. They're not going to do it. And I don't see why LGBT people in Northern Ireland have to wait when they have abused the petition of concern. So the majority of people in the Northern Ireland Assembly, majority of members, have voted for marriage equality, but the DUP has used the petition of concern under the Good Friday Agreement, which allows them to veto legislation they don't like. So, yeah, I think that's an abuse. The petition of concern was never intended to avoid discrimination, never intended to be used to block equality. This is about trying to ensure no sectarian legislation to adversely affect communities.
I wouldn't want the evening to finish, Peter, without giving you a moment to say something about the Peter Tatchell Foundation.
Okay, well, look, I'll just say that down the front here, there's a few flyers about my Human Rights Foundation. We do about 50% of our work on LGBT issues and 50% on other democracy, human rights, and equality issues. About half of what we do is UK-based, and about half is supporting democracy, human rights, equality, and LGBT campaigners in other countries. So if you're interested in the work we do, would like to find out more, please take one of the leaflets down here. On the back, it tells you how you can sign up to receive our email bulletins, which are free. And if you feel very mindful, you can perhaps make a small donation to help us carry on the work, because we don't get any organised funding. We're entirely dependent upon well-wishers. So if you can perhaps afford to give £3 or £5 a month, that would be really gratefully received. But if you're not, just take a leaflet and sign up, and the subscriptions to the email bulletins are free, so there's no charge, no obligation. Of course, once you've signed up, if you decide you don't like what we do, you can always unsubscribe. We do lots of issues that are below the radar. So we just published a report about the persecution of Ugandan refugees who'd fled imprisonment and attempts to kill them in Uganda and went to Kenya for safe refuge and are being horribly persecuted in Kenya. We've done other reports about, how many's heard of the Kalash minority in Pakistan? Okay. Kalash is one of the world's smallest religious and ethnic minorities. There's only about 4,000 of them left. And they're a very remote part of Pakistan, but they're now being terrorized mostly by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban because they're not true Muslims. So we've done quite a lot of work to try and profile the terrible persecution they're suffering and the failure of the Pakistan government to adequately protect them. So I think if you sign up, you'll find information about a lot of issues that are perhaps below the radar. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's been wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Peter.